My name is Amamira, and I was 34 years old when the world I had known since childhood came crashing down. 15th March 2019 was supposed to be the day I left this world in disgrace. Instead, it became the doorway into the first real life I had ever tasted. I often think back to that morning with a mixture of horror and wonder, because it marked both the end of the woman I used to be and the birth of the one I am today. When the judgment against me was pronounced weeks earlier, I felt the ground slip from beneath my feet. The Royal Council had declared I had brought shame, irreversible shame, upon the Saudi royal bloodline for failing to fulfill the one purpose that had been assigned to me since childhood. I had been raised to believe that the highest honor a woman could achieve was to produce male heirs. Nothing else mattered: my mind, my dreams, my voice, my soul. Only my womb had value. And when that womb betrayed their expectations, my life was considered forfeit. The sentence was delivered with a coldness I can still feel seeping into my bones when I remember it. My husband, Prince Khalid, stood over me in the grand reception hall where marble tiles reflected lights like 1,000 unblinking eyes. The physician's final report lay open on the table: primary ovarian insufficiency. A barren woman. A buried future. A stain on the family's heritage. The fact that I had concealed my condition, even in my own terror and confusion, sealed my fate. As I knelt on the polished floor, I heard the chief religious advisor recite the formal decree: 30 days to prepare my soul for execution. 30 days to contemplate how my existence had become an offense. 30 days to wait for death in a place that was already becoming my grave. When the guards escorted me to the basement chambers that night, I remember touching the simple white garments they handed me. "These are your new robes," one guard murmured without meeting my eyes. They resembled burial shrouds. In that moment, I realized they were signaling to me, and to themselves, that I had already been erased. Those first hours were suffocating. My heart pounded so violently that I feared it would give out before the execution ever came. I tried to pray, to find some trace of the God I had been taught to fear, but the walls seemed to swallow my voice. Heaven felt empty, distant, cold. Yet even in that pit of despair, a strange awareness tugged at the edges of my soul, like some invisible presence whispering, "This is not the end." I didn't know it at the time, but death itself was already losing its grip on me. I was born into a life of wealth and privilege in Riyadh, the kind of luxury most people only glimpse in magazines. My father was a successful oil executive with ties to the royal family, and my mother, a woman of striking beauty and exacting standards, had already decided what my life would look like long before I could form a single thought of my own. From the moment I could walk, my existence was meticulously crafted for one purpose: to become the perfect wife of a prince and bear his children, preferably sons. Mother would often say, "Amira, you are beautiful, of excellent family. One day, you will marry a prince and secure the future of your lineage." Her words were not suggestions, they were decrees. Every lesson she gave, every skill she taught, every word of discipline was in service to that singular destiny. I learned to walk gracefully, to sit with elegance, to speak with soft authority, and to smile in ways that conveyed respect, charm, and submission all at once. I studied calligraphy and poetry, religious doctrine, and the art of managing a household, as if each stroke of the pen or line of verse was another brick in the foundation of my future palace life. By the time I turned 12, my education became intense, almost suffocating. I was enrolled in a specialized school for girls destined to marry into royalty, a place where the curriculum was as much about obedience and protocol as it was about academics. We were trained in the subtleties of conversation, in the proper performance of religious duties, and in the unspoken rules of pleasing our future husbands. While other girls my age played with dolls and dreamed of freedom, I was being meticulously molded for a palace, for a life that existed only as an ideal in someone else's imagination. The central lesson of my childhood was clear: my worth was tied to my ability to produce sons. Teachers and elders constantly reminded us that a woman's greatest contribution to her family, and by extension, to society, was her fertility. Any failure in this duty would not only shame the woman herself but stain the family's honor. Religion, tradition, and society all reinforced the same brutal truth: a barren woman was worthless. I absorbed this truth so thoroughly that it became part of my identity long before I even knew what love or choice felt like. At 19, the arrangements were finalized. Prince Khalid, then 35, chose me as his third wife. His first wife, Zahra, had borne him two sons, the second, Fatima, one son and two daughters. Now it was my turn to fulfill the expectation that had been drilled into me since childhood. I remember feeling a mix of pride and fear. The wedding itself was a spectacle beyond my wildest imagination: hundreds of guests, days of celebration, a dizzying whirl of gold, silk, and ceremony. Moving into the palace felt like stepping into a dream that had been meticulously scripted since birth. But behind the glittering facade lay the invisible chains that would bind me far more tightly than any robe or chain ever could. From the first day, I understood my place. I was the newcomer, the one yet unproven, the one at the bottom of the hierarchy. Everything in the palace, from the servants' whispered judgments to the subtle glances of the other wives, reminded me that my primary function was to bear heirs. My education, my upbringing, my entire existence had prepared me for this: to produce life, and only life. Anything less was failure. And that expectation began to weigh on my shoulders with crushing force from the very first night. The palace was a world of opulence beyond imagination, but every luxury felt like a gilded cage. Marble floors stretched beneath my feet like cold mirrors, reflecting the perfection I was expected to embody. Golden fixtures gleamed, servants attended to every need, and yet, every comfort came with chains invisible but unbreakable. I quickly learned that luxury in the palace was a language of control. Every smile, every gesture, every word I spoke was measured against invisible standards, and every misstep could bring humiliation or worse. Hierarchy in the palace was rigid and merciless. Zahra, the first wife, radiated confidence born of power and achievement. She had given birth to two sons. Fatima, the second wife, wielded quiet authority with her one son and two daughters. And I, the third wife, was the lowest, a newcomer with nothing to show but beauty and promise. Everything about my life became a reminder that I had yet to prove my worth. I existed under constant scrutiny, a fragile presence in a world where every gaze measured my success in children yet unborn. From day one, my role was clear: to produce male heirs. The palace physician monitored my body with relentless precision, monthly appointments scrutinizing every cycle. Conversations with the other wives, servants, and religious advisors revolved around fertility. Herbs, special foods, prayers, rituals, every possible measure was employed to secure my ability to conceive. My life had become a relentless experiment, my body a project, my mind a battlefield between hope and fear. The pressure was immediate and suffocating. I remember lying awake at night, counting the days since marriage, imagining every possible way to meet expectations. I saw myself in mirrors and saw only inadequacy staring back. I was no longer a Mamira. I was a vessel under evaluation, and every day without a child deepened my sense of failure. The palace was a kingdom of riches, yet I was a pauper in the currency that mattered most: fertility. I tried to hide my growing despair, but it gnawed at me from the inside. Each whispered comparison to the other wives, each subtle remark about my lack of progress, was a knife to the heart. I began to realize that no amount of wealth, beauty, or skill could protect me from the reality of my body's betrayal. The very thing I had been groomed for, trained for, and expected to achieve was slipping from my grasp. My entire identity, everything I had been taught to value, was teetering on the edge of ruin. After 18 months of marriage without pregnancy, the dread in my heart became unbearable. I had begun to suspect that something was deeply wrong. Every treatment, every prayer, every ritual that once gave me hope now seemed futile. The golden palace walls that had once dazzled me now pressed in, stifling my spirit. I was trapped in a world that worshipped life yet condemned me for my inability to produce it. And in that pressure cooker of fear and expectation, I began to take secret steps that would ultimately change everything about my life and nearly cost me everything. By the time I reached the second year of marriage, the weight of expectation had become unbearable. Every glance from Zahra, every whispered comment from Fatima, every nod from the palace physician reminded me that I was failing at the one thing that defined my worth. I began to feel the walls of the palace closing in, and with that suffocating pressure came a desperate resolve. If I could not meet their expectations naturally, I would seek help in secret. The idea of sneaking out of the palace was terrifying. The palace itself was a fortress of surveillance and strict routines. Guards, attendants, and even the religious advisors knew my schedule intimately. A single misstep could expose me, and exposure meant not just shame, it meant death. But the fear of failure, of being cast out and executed, was stronger than any fear of being caught. I became a ghost within the palace, slipping away under the cover of pretense, changing my attire, and moving through Riyadh's streets as though I was someone else entirely. I visited private fertility clinics in secret, crafting elaborate lies to cover my absences. I am visiting my mother, I would tell my personal servant, who was sworn to obedience. Then, clad in ordinary clothes, I would take taxis across the city, concealing my identity and my shame. Each visit was a delicate dance of deception, anxiety, and hope. I knew that if Prince Khalid, or worse, the palace council, discovered these excursions, the consequences would be severe. Every heartbeat in the waiting rooms of sterile clinics was accompanied by the constant terror of discovery. Dr. Hassan, a fertility specialist at King Faisal Hospital, became my lifeline. Gentle, patient, and professional, he guided me through every test and procedure. Week after week, I returned to his office, enduring examinations, blood tests, and ultrasounds. Each time, I crafted new stories to cover my absences, shopping trips, visits to female relatives, religious obligations, but the effort to maintain these lies was draining, a heavy cloak I wore atop the already crushing burden of failure. And then came the news that shattered my world. In November 2018, Dr. Hassan sat me down and spoke with a quiet gravity that made the room feel impossibly small. He explained, with professional calmness, that I suffered from primary ovarian insufficiency, my ovaries were not functioning. I would never conceive, naturally or through medical intervention. Never. The word echoed in my mind like a death knell. It was not a diagnosis, it was a sentence. Everything I had been raised for, everything I had sacrificed, everything I had worked for, had been rendered impossible. I felt hollow, broken, and utterly alone. Driving back to the palace, I fought to compose myself. My hands trembled, my heart raced, and my thoughts spiraled. I knew I had no way to prepare for what awaited me. I could not tell anyone the truth, no one could understand the magnitude of my failure, and telling would only hasten my death. I returned to the palace, putting on the mask of normalcy, hiding the storm of grief and panic that consumed me inside. Every smile I gave, every word I spoke, was a lie stitched together from fear and desperation. I began to understand, in those long, lonely months, what it truly meant to carry a secret that could destroy your life. Every day I moved among people who believed I was still fulfilling my duty, every glance a reminder of my inadequacy, and every ritual a hollow echo of hope. I had become a prisoner within my own life, haunted by the knowledge that the world I had been groomed for was slipping irrevocably from my hands. By early 2019, the walls of my secret world began to crumble. Prince Khalid's patience had evaporated entirely. He had begun to notice the inconsistencies in my explanations, the subtle attempts at concealment, the absence of results. Rumors and suspicions coalesced into anger, and one morning, I was summoned to the royal physicians for an examination I could no longer avoid. The truth I had been hiding for months, was about to be revealed in the most public and unforgiving way possible. The royal physicians conducted a meticulous series of examinations, every step an affirmation of the failure I had been trying to deny. And then, in the grandeur of the reception hall, with the polished marble floors reflecting the severity of my predicament, Dr. Al-Rashid delivered the pronouncement. I knelt before Prince Khalid, my head bowed, my heart pounding like a drum of doom. His eyes, once distant and indifferent, now blazed with fury. The words cut through me like steel. Your Highness, the third wife suffers from complete ovarian failure. She has concealed this condition through deception. I felt as if the floor had opened beneath me. My knees sunk into the cold marble, and for a moment, I thought I would collapse entirely into despair. The hall seemed impossibly large, yet claustrophobic in its judgment. The other wives watched silently, Zahra with satisfaction, Fatima with a distant pity I could neither accept nor understand. I had no defense, no shield, no explanation that could possibly redeem me in their eyes. In that moment, I realized that my life as I had known it was over. The chief religious advisor, Sheikh Muhammad, arrived swiftly, accompanied by 2 other scholars. Their presence signaled the finality of the process. They convened, whispered, and conferred while I remained in a chamber under guard. Hours later, they returned, their faces solemn, their expressions unreadable. Then, without hesitation, Sheikh Muhammad declared my sentence, death. Not exile. Not divorce. Death. The reason was both simple and incomprehensible. I had dishonored the royal family, brought shame upon their lineage, and, in their eyes, threatened the continuity of royal heritage. I felt my legs give way, my heart constrict, and my lungs struggle for air. 30 days, 30 torturous days, were granted to prepare my soul. 30 days to contemplate a fate I could not escape, 30 days to reckon with the total collapse of everything I had known, loved, and been trained to achieve. The palace guards escorted me to a small, isolated chamber in the basement, stripped of my royal garments and adorned in white robes resembling burial shrouds. Everything about the room, from its narrow bed to the single window facing a blank courtyard wall, screamed death. I was already being treated as though I had ceased to exist. Isolation became my prison. My parents, informed of my disgrace, were forbidden from visiting. Servants who once attended me with devotion now averted their eyes. Even the guards who delivered my meals spoke only when necessary, as though acknowledging my existence might provoke punishment. And every day, Sheikh Muhammad visited to prepare me for the inevitable, reminding me of Allah's will, the righteousness of punishment, and the gravity of my sins. Prayer offered no comfort. The verses I had memorized, the rituals I had practiced all my life, rang hollow in a world where hope had been stripped away. I was a ghost trapped in a golden tomb, waiting for the day my body would finally catch up with the sentence that my society, my family, and my culture had imposed. Yet even in the depths of despair, a faint ember of awareness whispered to me, this is not the end. The first week of my 30-day sentence passed like a storm of silence. Every hour felt like a stone tied to my chest, dragging me deeper into an ocean of dread. My chamber in the basement had no clock, no calendar, only the haunting awareness that time was slipping away. I prayed mechanically, not out of devotion, but out of terror. I begged God to spare me. I begged Him to wake me from the nightmare. But the heavens remained as quiet as the cold stone walls surrounding me. On the 8th night, I was lying awake when I heard it, the faintest whisper drifting through the vent above my bed. At first I thought it was my imagination, a mind stretched too thin by fear. But then it came again, a soft female voice, trembling yet deliberate. Amamira, can you hear me? The sound jolted me upright. My heart hammered against my ribs. I recognized that voice. It belonged to Fatima, the second wife. The one who, unlike Zahra, had never mocked me or treated me with contempt. She spoke again, more urgently this time. I don't have long. Listen carefully. I climbed onto the bed and pressed my ear to the vent. The metal was cold, but her words warmed me like a spark in the dark. They are planning to move the date, she whispered. Sheikh Muhammad wants your execution advanced. Zahra is pushing him. They want you gone by the end of the week. A rush of fear seized me so violently I nearly lost my balance. Why? I whispered back, my voice cracking. Because Khalid's mother is returning from Dubai sooner than expected. They want the matter settled before she arrives. If she learns of your case, she'll intervene. She has compassion, more than all of them combined. I pressed my hand over my mouth to keep from crying out. Every word was a needle. The execution date was no longer 30 days away. It was only a handful of sunsets from now. How do you know this? I breathed. Because Zahra brags, Fatima replied bitterly. And because I heard the scholars discussing it. But I can't help you openly, they're watching everyone closely. If I make one wrong move, they'll silence me too. My throat tightened. Even in that pit of fear, I felt gratitude. Thank you, I whispered. You're risking everything. Fatima hesitated, then spoke softly, urgently. Listen to me, Amamira. You must find a way out. No one will come for you. No one will save you. If you want to live, you must act for yourself. Her words struck me like lightning. Escape? From a royal palace guarded day and night? From a sentence delivered by religious authority and signed by a prince? It sounded like insanity. But then Fatima added something that made my breath stop entirely. There is someone who wants to help you, she said. A servant named Rafiq. He knows the old passageway behind the laundry room. If you can reach it, you can get out of the palace before they move you to the execution compound. The wind suddenly went quiet. Footsteps echoed in the hallway outside my chamber. Fatima spoke one last hurried sentence before vanishing from the other side of the wall. Your window of escape is small. Trust Rafiq. And don't wait. The footsteps stopped right in front of my door. I jumped off the bed, heart pounding, breath trembling, my mind spinning with an impossible truth. There was a way out. But only if I dared to take it. The night of my escape came wrapped in terror and disbelief. My heart raced as I prepared, every nerve screaming that the risk was unimaginable. The walls of the palace, so gilded and imposing during the day, became a labyrinth of shadows and danger under the cover of darkness. Rafiq, the servant Fatima had mentioned, met me quietly in the laundry room, his face pale but determined. He led me through narrow corridors I had never known existed, passages hidden behind stacks of linen and crates of supplies. My mind was a storm of fear, but also, strangely, of hope, a fragile flame I dared not let die. We reached a small, seldom used exit that led to the street. The cold night air struck me like a shock, a reminder that freedom always comes with risk. Rafiq whispered urgently, "Run straight. Don't look back." And then, without another word, he disappeared into the shadows. Alone, I fled, my white robes catching on the rough edges of walls and railings, tearing as if trying to keep me tethered to the palace. Every step was a prayer, every heartbeat a plea for survival. I had been running for what felt like hours, weaving through Riyadh's quiet residential streets, when the impossible happened. I had barely caught my breath when a massive delivery truck ran a red light at full speed. The driver didn't see me. The SUV carrying me and my remaining palace escorts, a black vehicle I had been placed in under guard for transfer, was hit head-on. The impact was violent and unrelenting, throwing us into a blur of metal, glass, and chaos. I was hurled against the door, my body twisting in ways I never imagined possible. The sound of shattering glass and twisted steel filled my ears, the screams of the injured ringing like a nightmare I could not wake from. When the motion finally ceased, I found myself upside down, strapped in the seat, miraculously conscious. Blood coated my lips, pain lanced through my limbs. Beside me, the chief religious advisor and the guards were groaning, injured, immobilized. The doors of the SUV were jammed, the rear window shattered, leaving a narrow space that seemed almost miraculous, a tiny gap in the wreckage that was my only chance. Without thinking, driven by pure instinct, I unbuckled myself and crawled through the broken glass. My robes ripped further, my skin was cut, but I was free. The streets around me were alive with sirens and confusion, but no one stopped me. Somehow, the chaos of the accident had created the perfect cover. I ran, my torn white robes flapping like wings, my heart hammering with a mixture of fear, relief, and disbelief. Every step felt surreal. After what seemed like hours, I collapsed at the doorstep of a modest house in a quiet neighborhood. Exhaustion overtook me, my body trembling, my spirit teetering on the edge of despair and wonder. The door opened to reveal a woman who looked at me not with judgment, but with compassion. Her name was Sarah. An American aid worker, fluent in Arabic, she did not recoil at my torn robes or my bleeding form. Instead, she smiled gently and said, "You are safe here. Let me help you." For the first time in weeks, perhaps in my entire life, I felt that the world might not be entirely cruel. In that moment, as she guided me inside and tended to my wounds, I sensed the first stirrings of something I had never known, hope. In Sarah's modest home, I began to experience something I had never known, safety without expectation, care without condition, and compassion without judgment. For the first time in my life, someone looked at me and saw not my failures, not my ability to bear children, not my status as a royal wife, or the shame that had defined me, but simply me. She offered food, clean clothes, and a place to rest, yet never asked for explanations about my torn robes or bloodied appearance. In her presence, the crushing weight of guilt and fear began to loosen, if only slightly, and a strange sense of peace crept in. Sarah introduced me gently to her faith. She never pushed or forced me to speak about religion, but her life itself was a testimony. Every action, every prayer before meals, every word of encouragement revealed a God who cared for individuals rather than status or tradition. She shared stories of Jesus, not as a distant figure, but as someone who loved women, defended the oppressed, and saw worth where the world saw none. I listened quietly, my heart skeptical yet intrigued, because for the first time, someone offered me love without conditions, without measuring my value against my accomplishments or obedience. She gave me a Bible translated into Arabic, suggesting I might find comfort and understanding in its stories. That night, alone in a small bedroom, I began to read. The Gospels were unlike anything I had ever known. Women were healed, defended, and cherished. They were not defined by their failures, their fertility, or their obedience to men, they were valued simply for who they were. I read about Mary Magdalene, about the woman at the well, about the woman with the issue of blood, and I felt a stirring in my heart I could not explain. For the first time, I sensed that my worth might not be tied to the impossible expectations of my past. 3rd April 2019, 19 days after my escape, was the night that changed everything. I was reading the story of the woman caught in adultery when the words seemed to leap off the page, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." I felt as if the message was written not for her, but for me. All my shame, all my fear, all the guilt that had defined my life, the crushing burden of being deemed worthless, suddenly collided with the possibility of forgiveness, of being loved unconditionally. Tears streamed down my face as I realized that Jesus was offering a love entirely different from the rules, the judgments, and the expectations that had shaped my entire existence. That night, kneeling in the quiet of Sarah's living room, I surrendered my heart to Jesus Christ. I confessed every fear, every failure, every secret, and every moment of despair. And in that surrender, I felt a peace so profound that it seemed to wash over every broken part of me. The burden I had carried since childhood, the pressure to produce heirs, to meet the impossible standards of royalty, to live up to a culture that saw me only as a vessel, began to dissolve. For the first time, I understood a God who loved me, not for what I could do, but simply for who I was. That night marked the beginning of my real life. Not as a third wife, not as a prisoner of shame, not as a woman condemned for her inability to conform to human expectations, but as a beloved daughter of God, free from the chains that had bound me my entire life. For the first time, I knew that life could be more than survival, it could be hope, purpose, and joy beyond measure. The days and weeks that followed my conversion were unlike anything I had ever experienced. On one hand, a profound joy had taken root in my heart, an unshakable certainty that I was loved and valued beyond measure. On the other, I had to grapple with grief that ran deeper than I had ever known. I was cut off from my family, from the wealth and security of the palace, and from the life I had been groomed for since childhood. Though I had escaped death physically, the emotional and cultural wounds of a lifetime of expectation and oppression were still raw, bleeding beneath the surface. Sarah became my guide in this new life. She introduced me to an underground network of believers, women and men who had themselves left behind oppressive cultures to embrace freedom in Christ. They taught me how to navigate a completely foreign society, helping me understand the laws, culture, and opportunities of my new home while offering emotional and spiritual support. I learned to live outside the confines of fear, judgment, and ritualized control. Slowly, the chains of shame that had bound me began to loosen, replaced by a growing sense of self-worth and purpose. Learning about Jesus reshaped my understanding of my identity. For years, I had believed that my value was entirely tied to my ability to produce heirs, to please men, and to fulfill societal and religious expectations. Every failure had been amplified, every disappointment felt like a moral and spiritual death. But now, I discovered that my worth was intrinsic. It was not earned, bought, or measured it was a gift. The same God who had orchestrated my miraculous escape had also orchestrated a spiritual rescue, one that transcended fear, shame, and cultural expectation. During this time, I also faced the challenge of practical survival. I had to rebuild a life from scratch in a foreign country, navigating language barriers, unfamiliar customs, and the bureaucracy of refugee status. Every day was an exercise in faith and endurance. But even in the mundane, finding an apartment, enrolling in classes, or securing employment, I began to see God's providence in the small details. Doors that seemed closed would open, people I had never met offered help, and little coincidences often revealed themselves as divine guidance. As my physical safety became assured and my spiritual life deepened, I felt a stirring within me to help others. My story was unique, but the pain and oppression I had endured was not. Women trapped in forced marriages, honor-based oppression, and religious persecution existed in vast numbers. I began volunteering with organizations that assisted women in escaping these dangerous situations. My own journey of fear, suffering, and miraculous deliverance became a powerful testimony to the hope and transformation that Jesus could bring. Each act of service reminded me that what the enemy had intended for harm, God could, and did, use for good. By the end of my first year in this new life, I was no longer just surviving, I was beginning to thrive. The emotional scars remained, but they no longer defined me. Instead, they became the foundation of empathy, courage, and purpose. I realized that my past, terrible though it was, had prepared me to minister to others in ways I could never have imagined. And in that realization, I felt the first true sense of freedom in my life, not just freedom from death, but freedom to live fully as the woman God had always intended me to be. As I settled into my new life, God began to place a burden on my heart that I could no longer ignore. My own story of fear, oppression, and miraculous deliverance was powerful, but I realized it could serve a greater purpose. There were countless women trapped in situations like mine, women whose lives were dictated by honor, fertility, and obedience, whose worth had been measured by others, and who faced persecution, imprisonment, or worse simply for being themselves. I could no longer live for myself alone. God was calling me to minister to these women, to be a voice and refuge where there had previously been silence and despair. With the help of Sarah and her network, I began volunteering with organizations that aided women fleeing abusive or oppressive situations in Islamic contexts. At first, it was as simple as offering a listening ear, helping someone navigate the complex bureaucracy of asylum, or connecting them with safe housing. But as I shared my story, I saw the impact it had. Women who had resigned themselves to hopelessness began to lift their heads. They dared to imagine freedom, safety, and even faith as something real, tangible, and available to them. Every tear I dried, every hand I held, reminded me of the God who had rescued me, body, mind, and soul. Over the next year, I worked tirelessly to expand my reach. I partnered with aid groups, community leaders, and legal advocates to create a network of safe locations across North America. Women who had once been invisible, silenced, or condemned began to find refuge. Through my ministry, I could ensure that escape from persecution was not just a fleeting chance, but a real opportunity for restoration. The lives I touched became living proof that the same God who had saved me could intervene in even the most impossible situations. My ministry, which I later named Daughters of Hope, focused not only on physical safety but on spiritual renewal. I taught women about Jesus' love, a love that did not measure worth by fertility, obedience, or submission, but by intrinsic value as children of God. Many were skeptical, many fearful, but slowly, one by one, I watched them encounter the same freedom and acceptance I had experienced. Over the course of 5 years, I personally led 47 women to Christ, each story as dramatic and heartbreaking as my own. Seeing their faces light up, witnessing the chains of shame and fear fall from their hearts, it was the most profound reward I had ever known. Through this work, I also began to redefine what family and fulfillment meant for me. I eventually married David Brake Ane, a man who loved me not for what I could provide, but for who I was in Christ. Together, we adopted two daughters from Somalia, girls who had also faced extreme hardship and persecution. Our family became a living testimony to God's redemptive power. What the enemy intended for evil had been transformed into hope, joy, and generational blessing. Looking back, I see that every step, from the palace floor to the hospital exam, from my near execution to miraculous escape, was orchestrated for a purpose far greater than I could have imagined. God had not only saved my life, He had prepared me to save others. And every life I touch now stands as a witness to the fact that even in our darkest moments, God's love is unwavering, unstoppable, and transformative. As Daughters of Hope grew, I began to understand the full depth of God's plan for my life. My story, once a tale of shame, fear, and impending death, had become a vessel for blessing, healing, and transformation. Each woman who found refuge in our homes reminded me that what the enemy intended for evil, God could turn for good. Every prayer, every counseling session, every hand held in encouragement was proof that redemption was possible even in the most hopeless circumstances. The work was not easy. Many of the women we helped were broken physically, emotionally, and spiritually. Some had endured forced marriages, honor-based violence, or religious persecution. Others arrived with nothing but the clothes on their backs, carrying scars that could not be seen but were deeply felt. Guiding them to safety, supporting them through legal battles, and helping them navigate the complex transition into a new life required patience, wisdom, and constant reliance on God's guidance. But through it all, I saw the power of love in action, love that healed, restored, and empowered. One of the most profound lessons I learned was the importance of identity in Christ. For so long, I had been defined by expectations, rules, and judgments that had nothing to do with who I truly was. Now, I encouraged the women in our care to discover their identity as beloved daughters of God. We spent time in prayer, reading scripture, and sharing testimonies of God's faithfulness. Little by little, I watched as women who had once felt worthless begin to walk with confidence, hope, and courage. The transformation was often slow, sometimes messy, but always real. The impact of Daughters of Hope began to ripple beyond our immediate circle. Refugee organizations, churches, and humanitarian groups began partnering with us, recognizing the unique ministry we offered. We were able to expand our safe houses, provide legal advocacy, and offer educational programs for women and children. Each success story reinforced the truth I had come to know personally, that God's power to redeem, restore, and heal is unlimited. What once seemed impossible, freedom, safety, acceptance, love, was now a reality for dozens of women whose lives had been defined by oppression and fear. Through it all, my personal life flourished in ways I had never imagined. My marriage to David Brake Ane brought a joy I had never known, a partnership built on love, mutual respect, and shared faith. Together, we embraced our role as parents, adopting two daughters from Somalia who had themselves endured unimaginable hardship. Raising them in a household filled with love, faith, and security was a living testimony of God's redemption. What I had once thought was a curse, barrenness, shame, and despair, had been transformed into purpose, family, and hope. Now, as I look back on the journey from the palace basement to my new life in freedom, I understand that every trial, every tear, every moment of fear was a step toward the calling God had placed on my life. My past is no longer a chain, it is a bridge that connects me to those who are still trapped in darkness. And every life I touch is a reminder that even in the face of impossible odds, God's love is greater, His mercy unending, and His plans for His children unstoppable. Today, as I reflect on the journey that began in a gilded palace filled with judgment and oppression, I am overwhelmed by the magnitude of God's grace. From the day I was sentenced to death for failing to fulfill expectations imposed on me as a third wife, to the miraculous crash that gave me a second chance, and finally to the life I now lead in freedom and purpose, every moment has been a testament to God's power to transform despair into hope, death into life, and shame into redemption. I have come to understand that my story is not about the cruelty of men, the rigidity of culture, or even my own failures. It is about God's relentless love and the ways He works even through the most impossible circumstances. The palace, with its strict hierarchies and suffocating expectations, tried to define my worth by fertility and obedience. But in Christ, my value was redefined. I discovered that worth is not measured by human standards, but by the Creator who made me, loved me, and called me His own. Through Daughters of Hope, I have been able to extend that same love to women who were trapped, silenced, or condemned. I have seen them rise from despair to courage, from shame to confidence, and from fear to freedom. I have watched women, once invisible to the world, walk boldly into new lives, carrying with them the knowledge that they are cherished, valued, and powerful in God's eyes. Every woman I minister to reminds me of my own journey, and every success story reinforces that God's power is greater than any obstacle or oppression. My personal life, too, has been a living testament to resurrection. Married to David Brake Ane, we have built a home filled with love, faith, and joy. Our adopted daughters from Somalia, who escaped persecution like I once did, now know the safety and affection that was denied to me in my youth. Together, our family stands as proof that God can take broken circumstances and weave them into something beautiful, a life of hope, compassion, and purpose that extends far beyond what the world can imagine. And yet, I know that my story is not just about survival, it is about legacy. Every woman I help, every soul I lead to Christ, every safe house we establish, is a continuation of God's work in my life. What was once a tale of imminent death has become a story of resurrection, impact, and eternal significance. The very chains meant to destroy me became the foundation upon which God built a ministry that transforms lives across continents. To anyone listening to my story, I want you to know this: no matter how hopeless your circumstances, no matter how impossible the odds, no matter what shame or fear has defined your life, Jesus offers a love that cannot be earned, a grace that cannot be measured, and a purpose that surpasses understanding. If He could save me, a woman facing death for failing to meet human expectations, He can save anyone. Every breath I take, every life I touch, every prayer I lift is a testament to that truth. My life, once sentenced to death, is now dedicated to showing the world that what God calls impossible is simply the canvas on which His glory is revealed. From despair to deliverance, from darkness to light, from death to resurrection, this is the story of my life, and the story of countless women who will rise because God's love never fails.